The restaurant was a gleaming monument to luxury, its crystal chandeliers scattering prisms of light across polished mahogany tables, and the low hum of fine china and whispered conversations creating an almost intoxicating ambiance. Julia walked in, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, her heart pounding with anticipation and an undercurrent of apprehension. She was carrying the faint weight of the morning's frustration like a silent armor, and though she was impeccably dressed in a tailored cream dress that skimmed her knees and a light cashmere shawl draped around her shoulders, there was a tension in her posture that spoke louder than her composed exterior. The hostess greeted her with a warm smile that failed to mask the subtle curiosity in her eyes as she led Julia toward a table already occupied by her sister Melissa and her children, a table lavishly adorned with gleaming silverware and plates stacked high with delicacies that easily cost more than a month U.S. groceries for some families. Julia's gaze lingered on the extravagance. The golden brown crust of freshly baked bread, delicate truffle pasta glistening under the soft light, and desserts that looked as though they had been sculpted by artists. She tightened her grip on her purse, her knuckles whitening as Melissa glanced up and her eyes briefly flickered across Julia's face, registering a hint of surprise before she turned back to her children. "We didn't order for your son," Melissa said in a tone that was both casual and cutting, sliding a bread basket toward Julia's young son who looked up at her with wide, uncertain eyes. He hesitated, glancing between Julia and his cousins who were unabashedly consuming dishes that could have fed an entire neighborhood, the indulgence of their laughter ringing cruelly in the air. Julia's chest tightened as she knelt down beside him, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead, forcing a gentle smile as if she were offering reassurance against the sting of rejection. Her internal monologue churned. This had been the first time she had allowed herself to hope that a family gathering could feel safe, and yet the cold reality of her sister ES behavior struck her with the precision of a scalpel. She could see the children's expectation of privilege written in their eager faces, a sense of entitlement that Julia's own son had never been afforded, and it set off a storm of emotions within her, ranging from quiet anger to the simmering desire to prove herself, to reclaim dignity, not just for her son, but for the years she had endured silent judgments and passive cruelty from her family. The waiter approached a tall man with impeccable posture and an easy smile, and Julia's son murmured a shy thank you, clutching a piece of bread as though it were a shield against the shame that had settled like a weight on his small shoulders. Julia's mind raced, noting every detail of the scene. The way Melissa's eyes sparkled with an almost imperceptible triumph as she watched her children, the delicate chime of cutlery against fine china, the subtle perfume of roses mingling with the rich aroma of truffle butter and seared meats. She felt the heat of her own resolve build, a quiet determination that this encounter would not define them, would not dictate their worth. She reached out to squeeze her son's hand, whispering words meant more for herself than for him, a reminder that they had endured worse, and that the world, while sometimes cruel, could be confronted with intelligence, grace, and unwavering courage. Across the table, Melissa chatted effortlessly with the server about wine pairings, a deliberate display of social dominance, and Julia felt the familiar swell of indignation. She knew that Melissa thrived on control, on making others feel small in comparison, and Julia resolved that she would not allow the afternoon to slip away under the weight of humiliation. Her gaze swept across the restaurant, noting the subtle nods of recognition from other diners who whispered about the spectacle unfolding, and she realized that this public display, though uncomfortable, could be leveraged. She began to craft in her mind a series of careful, deliberate actions. She would maintain composure, she would observe, she would anticipate the movements of everyone at the table, and she would transform the perceived disadvantage into an opportunity for a subtle but undeniable assertion of dignity. Conversation continued, punctuated by the laughter of Melissa's children, their careless enjoyment of the finest foods, and Julia maintained a careful balance, engaging her son in quiet conversation, distracting him from the sting of exclusion, while simultaneously gathering intelligence about her sister's temperament and the dynamics of the gathering. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats, buttered pastries, and the underlying tension of unspoken judgments, creating a sensory tapestry that Julia navigated with a keen sense of strategy. She made mental notes of the positions of the other diners, the placement of silverware, and the timing of the service, all while engaging her son with gentle questions about his day, stories of school, and tales of imaginative adventures, drawing him away from the emotional sting and into a cocoon of shared warmth and trust. As the main courses arrived, Julia's son was presented with a small side dish from the kitchen, modest, simple, but carefully prepared, and Julia offered a soft word of encouragement, guiding him to take a bite with pride, teaching him through action that self-worth was not measured by the extravagance of a meal or the approval of others. Across the table, Melissa's eyes briefly narrowed, sensing perhaps the subtle defiance in Julia's quiet composure, the way she had refused to cower, and Julia smiled inwardly, recognizing the first spark of empowerment flickering in the midst of discomfort. The children continued their unabashed indulgence, unaware of the deeper battle unfolding at the adult level, while Julia's mind meticulously charted the coming steps, considering the conversations she would steer, the moments she would seize, and the ways in which she could demonstrate to her son and to her sister that dignity, intelligence, and strategic calm could outweigh the loud arrogance of wealth or entitlement. Each gesture, each word, each subtle movement became part of an intricate dance of observation and response, and Julia felt a steady pulse of control and anticipation. This was not merely a meal. It was the opening of a stage where she would quietly, yet unmistakably, claim her space and assert the respect that had long been denied. The server returned with a perfectly chilled dessert tray, placing delicate portions before Melissa's children with careful ceremony, and Julia's son looked longingly, but she met his gaze and offered him a choice: to savor what he had to enjoy the moment, or to let envy cloud his experience. He chose the former, and Julia's heart swelled with pride at his instinctive wisdom, a reflection of lessons she had patiently instilled over the years. Melissa, noticing the subtle shift in demeanor, attempted a casual laugh, but there was an edge to it, a recognition that Julia's quiet strength was something she could not dismiss. The afternoon continued, a tense interplay of etiquette, observation, and internal calculation, with Julia maintaining a poised exterior while plotting the emotional and strategic currents that would shape the remainder of the encounter, setting the stage for moves that would eventually turn perceived humiliation into a deeply satisfying assertion of self-respect, all while teaching her son invaluable lessons about resilience, composure, and the quiet power of intelligence and emotional insight in the face of arrogance and entitlement. The room seemed to contract around them, each moment charged with a subtle electricity, the undercurrent of tension mingling with the aromas, the sound of laughter, and the soft clatter of utensils, while Julia continued to navigate the situation with a combination of maternal instinct, strategic observation, and the growing thrill of silently reclaiming control in an environment designed to intimidate. By the time coffee was served, the initial shock of exclusion had begun to transform into a steady, burning determination, a recognition that this day, seemingly ordinary and painfully humiliating at first, could become the foundation of a clever, satisfying, and emotionally resonant victory for both her and her son. She engaged Melissa in polite, carefully structured conversation, subtly directing discussion toward topics where Julia's insights shone, moments where her son's small gestures of courtesy or intelligence highlighted his own resilience, and glimpses of a familial truth that could not be masked by expensive meals or superficial displays of privilege. Each observation, each carefully measured word, and each small act of grace and courage laid the groundwork for what would come next. The next stages of confrontation, strategy, and ultimately empowerment. As Julia positioned herself to turn the afternoon from a potential moment of shame into a multi-layered lesson in dignity, observation, and the subtle yet undeniable assertion of her own agency. And through it all, She felt the pulse of her son's quiet admiration and trust, a steady current of love and loyalty that buoyed her as she navigated the complex dynamics of family, wealth, and social expectation, preparing the stage for the deeper confrontations, clever maneuvers, and emotionally charged resolutions that awaited in the sections to follow. The city's sunlight waned outside the towering windows, casting long shadows across the table, while the low hum of conversation and clinking of glass created a backdrop that seemed almost cinematic in its intensity. Julia remained vigilant yet calm, her mind alive with strategy, her heart anchored in love, and her spirit quietly ablaze with the certainty that the afternoon was merely the beginning of a narrative that she would control with intelligence, courage, and unshakable composure, setting the tone for the unfolding drama, the intricate power plays, and the eventual reclamation of dignity and empowerment that would define the next chapters of this cinematic story. As the afternoon deepened into early evening, the golden light from the setting sun spilled across the restaurant's polished floors, casting long, elegant shadows that seemed to stretch and curl around the table where Julia, her son, and her sister sat, a microcosm of tension and unspoken challenge framed by opulence and quiet scrutiny. Julia felt every nuance of the environment, every subtle shift in body language, every glance that could carry judgment or disdain, and she moved through it with deliberate awareness. Each decision calculated to protect her son while simultaneously asserting a quiet dominance over the subtle power dynamics that Melissa had been attempting to enforce since their arrival. Conversation around them continued in a low, cultured hum, but at their table, the air was taut, an invisible thread of competitive energy that pulled and twisted with every gesture. Julia's eyes flicked to her sister as Melissa laughed softly at one of her children's brash comments, a carefully cultivated expression of superiority. And Julia recognized the pattern immediately. Her sister relied on theatrics, on controlling perception, on making wealth and indulgence the metrics of authority. But Julia had long ago learned that authority, true authority, could exist quietly, firmly, in the spaces between words, in gestures that communicated restraint, insight, and the patient orchestration of outcomes. She leaned slightly closer to her son, her voice low and soothing, and began weaving a narrative that encouraged him to observe, to reflect, to understand the intricacies of human behavior, teaching him through lived example that strength was often silent, and intelligence could wield a far greater influence than loud entitlement. Her son listened, eyes wide but thoughtful, absorbing each word, each subtle encouragement, and Julia felt a swell of pride. Across the table, Melissa's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, catching the undertone of strategic calm that Julia carried like a second skin. And for the first time that afternoon, a shadow of uncertainty flickered across her sister's carefully controlled facade. Plates were cleared, dessert presented, and Julia's son ate with quiet satisfaction, his demeanor a stark contrast to the unbridled indulgence of his cousins, yet carrying with him a sense of dignity that spoke volumes more than extravagant portions ever could. Julia's mind, meanwhile, churned with possibilities, the ways she could steer conversation, the timing of subtle remarks, the calculated display of knowledge and composure that would slowly dismantle the unspoken hierarchy Melissa had assumed she controlled. She engaged her sister in light conversation about family memories, travel, and shared acquaintances, carefully planting seeds of reflection, encouraging moments where Melissa's assumptions about superiority might clash with reality, where the arrogance of entitlement could be mirrored against subtle intelligence, and where her son's quiet grace could speak louder than any monetary display. Each gesture was layered, a hand placed gently on her son's shoulder, a quiet nod of acknowledgement to the server, a poised laugh at a comment that could have been used to humiliate. Each action meticulously calibrated to reinforce control without aggression, to assert presence without confrontation, to turn every potential slight into an opportunity for emotional and psychological empowerment. Outside the windows, the cityscape glimmered as evening descended, its lights reflecting like jewels across the darkening streets, a mirrored backdrop to the intricacies unfolding inside. And Julia felt the quiet thrill of strategy taking shape, the rise of possibility that what had begun as an afternoon tinged with humiliation could transform into a tableau of subtle but undeniable triumph. Melissa's children continued their indulgence, their voices a constant reminder of privilege, yet Julia used it as a counterpoint, drawing her son into discussions that highlighted empathy, restraint, and appreciation, quietly demonstrating through dialogue and example that values of character, observation, and intelligence outweighed the shallow metrics of wealth and ostentation. The conversation shifted to broader family matters, and Julia allowed herself to subtly guide the discussion toward topics where she had expertise and insight, each comment measured, deliberate, and designed to expose the limits of Melissa's bravado. Her sister responded with carefully timed retorts, polite yet sharp, each exchange a mini-battle of wit and perception. Yet Julia maintained a steady, composed exterior, all while inwardly cataloging each nuance, each hint of insecurity, and each opening for leverage that could be exploited later. In the ebb and flow of dialogue, Julia's son mirrored her calm, demonstrating subtle maturity that both impressed and unsettled Melissa. The child's quiet assurance, a testament to years of nurturing resilience, empathy, and intelligence in the face of challenge. The evening progressed with a meticulous dance, Julia maintaining her poise, her son absorbing lessons not through admonishment, but through living example, and Melissa adjusting her strategy incrementally, revealing cracks in her armor that Julia noted with quiet satisfaction. When coffee arrived, the atmosphere thickened, the subtle electricity of observation and anticipation intertwining with the rich aroma of roasted beans, the soft clinking of cups against saucers, and the gentle murmur of conversation across the room. Julia sensed the moment approaching when passive observation would give way to more active, yet still controlled assertion. She allowed herself a brief pause to reflect on the journey that had brought them here. Years of navigating familial tension, of silently observing entitlement, of learning patience, restraint, and the power of subtle influence. Her son, glancing up at her with trust and admiration, reinforced the importance of every careful step she took. The server, discreetly attentive, cleared plates with impeccable timing, and Julia seized the opportunity to make her next move. A carefully framed story that illustrated empathy, foresight, and quiet accomplishment, one that subtly contrasted with Melissa's earlier display of extravagance and entitlement. Melissa's initial attempts to interrupt or assert dominance were met with measured acknowledgement, a soft, polite smile, and a gentle redirection, demonstrating Julia's ability to control not through volume or aggression, but through precision, patience, and emotional intelligence. Each exchange, each glimmer of recognition, each quiet moment of self-assertion began to shift the dynamic of the table, and Julia felt the simmering satisfaction of witnessing the subtle, almost imperceptible realignment of power. Her son participated in the conversation with quiet confidence, his words carefully considered, his demeanor reflecting the values Julia had instilled. And in these moments, she recognized that the victory was not merely symbolic, but deeply substantive, reinforcing character, self-worth, and the profound impact of strategic, intelligent engagement. The sun had long since dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows that pooled across the restaurant, and Julia felt the pulse of tension, strategy, and emotional resonance reach its apex. She observed Melissa's posture, the shifting expressions, and the unspoken calculations, noting where control had wavered and where leverage had subtly shifted. The final phase of Section 2 would see Julia further manipulating conversation, using timing and careful word choice to underscore the value of empathy, intelligence, and composure over entitlement, subtly revealing to her sister the hollowness of arrogance while simultaneously empowering her son with lived examples of resilience and dignity. As dessert plates were cleared and the last sips of coffee were enjoyed, Julia allowed herself a quiet, inward smile, recognizing that the afternoon, fraught with tension and potential humiliation, had transformed into a carefully orchestrated sequence of psychological and emotional victories. She had maintained grace under pressure, leveraged observation and insight, and demonstrated, in the quietest but most powerful ways, that dignity and intelligence could outshine privilege and ostentation. Melissa's subtle acknowledgement, the brief flicker of recognition in her eyes, the unspoken understanding that her sister had not merely survived the encounter, but subtly dominated it, offered a thrill of satisfaction to Julia. She glanced at her son, noting the calm pride in his eyes, the reflection of lessons absorbed not through lectures but through subtle example, and felt the deep resonance of triumph that came not from confrontation, but from quiet, intelligent, emotionally charged strategy. The city beyond continued its rhythm, indifferent to the small but significant transformation occurring within the restaurant walls. Yet for Julia and her son, the evening represented a turning point, a vivid, living demonstration that power, control, and self-respect could be asserted without aggression, that subtlety and intelligence were formidable forces, and that the path to ultimate empowerment and reclamation of dignity had been successfully paved, setting the stage for the final, climactic section where culmination, emotional resolution, and the true assertion of justice and self-worth would unfold in all their cinematic intensity. The evening had fully descended, the warm glow of city lights spilling through the restaurant's floor-to-ceiling windows and painting everything in hues of gold and amber. A cinematic backdrop that made the tension at the table feel almost tangible, as though the world outside had paused to witness the unfolding drama of quiet power and restrained defiance. Julia felt a surge of controlled exhilaration as she observed the final moments of this carefully orchestrated encounter. Every gesture, every glance, every subtle inflection had been building toward this crescendo, the point where she would convert months, years even, of endurance into a definitive assertion of dignity, intelligence, and emotional strength. Melissa had begun to grow restless, the slight tightening around her mouth and the flicker of irritation in her eyes betraying the cracks Julia had anticipated, and she knew that the moment for her strategic and calculated revelation was approaching. She leaned slightly closer to her son, ensuring that he felt safe, seen, and included, and whispered words of encouragement that were part comfort, part subtle coaching, guiding him to hold his head high and absorb the lessons embedded in every nuanced exchange. The server discreetly brought the check, placing it on the polished table with the quiet efficiency that marked the rhythm of the evening, and Julia allowed herself a moment to savor the sight. Melissa's casual assumption that Julia would defer, that her son would continue to be marginalized, had met its first subtle but undeniable resistance. Julia began speaking, her voice calm, measured, and carrying the weight of confidence that could not be ignored, recounting a recent challenge she had faced, an elegantly framed story of perseverance, clever problem-solving, and quiet triumph that drew the attention of the server, nearby diners, and most importantly, her sister. Melissa attempted to interject, to steer attention back to herself, but Julia's timing was flawless. A gentle, polite acknowledgement, a soft smile, and she seamlessly redirected the narrative, each word chosen to convey not arrogance, but undeniable competence and resilience, a demonstration of strength that was impossible to dismiss. Her son listened attentively, his small hands folded in his lap, absorbing not just the story, but the rhythm of courage, the cadence of calm authority, and the subtle ways in which power could be exercised without aggression. Julia's eyes met her sister's across the table, and in that brief instant, she communicated a message far deeper than any words could convey. The quiet assertion of dignity, the intelligent management of perception, and the unwavering commitment to one's principles could dismantle entitlement more efficiently than confrontation ever could. Melissa's fingers hovered over the folded napkin before her, her carefully crafted composure beginning to waver under the weight of the unspoken truths Julia had threaded into her words. Julia pressed the advantage, weaving in observations of empathy, intelligence, and subtle kindness that highlighted the contrast between true character and superficial privilege. Her son, emboldened by his mother's calm power, contributed small but thoughtful comments, polite and precise, reinforcing the lesson that respect was earned, not bought, and that confidence and composure could illuminate one's value far more brightly than any material display. The tension at the table thickened, charged with a heady mix of revelation, subtle triumph, and the delicate unraveling of assumptions Melissa had long held. Julia Atkiss' internal monologue flowed with clarity. This was the apex of a narrative carefully constructed over the hours, a dance of wit, observation, and emotional intelligence that had transformed a potentially humiliating scenario into a platform for empowerment, and she savored the satisfaction of witnessing the realignment of perception and control. Outside, the city lights shimmered like a constellation of distant ambitions, and Julia allowed herself a moment to draw strength from the expansive view, her resolve crystallizing. This evening would become a defining memory, not for Melissa's extravagance, but for the elegance, intelligence, and moral fortitude with which she had guided herself and her son. Dessert concluded, plates cleared, and the check discreetly handled, Julia orchestrated the final moments of engagement with subtle precision, ensuring that each farewell, each gesture of politeness, and each shared word carried the weight of quiet mastery. Melissa's initial attempts at dominance had been gradually met with calm, well-timed responses, and now the culmination was evident. A subtle nod, a fleeting acknowledgement, a flicker of recognition that Julia had not merely survived the encounter, but had orchestrated it into a narrative of quiet victory and affirmation. Julia's son mirrored her composure, carrying the lessons of the day like armor, and in those reflective moments, she understood the profound impact of the experience. They had not only endured, but had redefined the parameters of respect, agency, and empowerment in the most subtle yet indelible manner. As they rose to leave, Julia ensured that each movement, her hand lightly resting on her son's shoulder, her poised demeanor, and her careful eye contact with Melissa, communicated a layered message of dignity, competence, and silent triumph. Melissa's expression flickered with conflicting emotions: pride, begrudging recognition, and the faint stirrings of unease. A cocktail of sentiments that revealed the potency of Julia's strategy, the effectiveness of restraint, and the unassailable nature of quiet, intelligent authority. The walk to the car was suffused with a reflective calm, the city streets awash in the mellow glow of streetlights, the cool evening air carrying the soft hum of life, and Julia felt an expansive sense of relief mixed with exhilaration. She observed her son's posture, his confidence subtly increased, his sense of self-worth reinforced not by material abundance, but by the lived experience of dignity, strategic intelligence, and maternal guidance. They reached the car, and Julia allowed herself a private smile, a brief internal acknowledgement that the afternoon, fraught with tension and potential humiliation, had been transformed into a profound lesson in empowerment, composure, and emotional mastery. Her son leaned against her, trusting and calm, and Julia recognized the lasting impact. This day would resonate far beyond the confines of the restaurant, shaping perception, character, and self-esteem in a manner that no fleeting display of wealth could ever replicate. As the city hummed around them, Julia Atkiss' thoughts crystallized on the essential truth she had embodied throughout the evening. True strength lies not in loud declarations or extravagant displays, but in observation, patience, strategic action, and the quiet, unwavering assertion of dignity, intelligence, and emotional resilience. Melissa's earlier acts of condescension and superficial power had been effectively neutralized, transformed into opportunities for demonstration of subtle mastery, and Julia felt a profound satisfaction, not of vengeance, but of rightful, clever empowerment that honored both herself and her son. By the time they arrived home, the city's lights twinkling like distant stars against the velvet night, Julia's sense of achievement had deepened. She had taught her son lessons in courage, intelligence, and composure that no amount of privilege could overshadow, had subtly corrected misconceptions of entitlement, and had orchestrated an encounter that affirmed the power of calm, strategic, and emotionally charged action. The door closed behind them, the warmth of home enveloping them like a protective embrace, and Julia felt the full resonance of her victory, a complex cinematic tapestry of subtle triumph, maternal strength, and unwavering dignity. She held her son close, whispering words of affirmation, pride, and love, and in those intimate moments, recognized that the real culmination had been quiet, yet profound. Empowerment achieved not through confrontation, but through intelligence, strategy, emotional acuity, and the patient orchestration of circumstance. In the following days, the echoes of the encounter would ripple subtly through family interactions, with Melissa aware, if outspokenly, of the shifting dynamics, and Julia confident in the knowledge that she had asserted not only her own agency, but also nurtured resilience, pride, and insight in her son, a legacy far more enduring than any material indulgence could offer. And as the night deepened, Julia allowed herself a moment of reflection, savoring the cinematic intensity of the afternoon's journey. Tension transformed into empowerment, humiliation into strategic mastery, and exclusion into a subtle but undeniable assertion of dignity and influence, a narrative woven with intelligence, patience, and heart that would endure far beyond the golden light of that unforgettable evening.